Hey guys, this is the next leg of our 100 followers special. I'm sorry for this being so late, but let's get right to it. Editing me here past me had totally forgotten to put myself in the video because I'm a bit goofy, so instead I offer you PNG. Most important thing is that Steve the Mighty Plahash is here. He must always be present, or the world order will unknowingly collapse into utter chaos. Thank you. Now, on to the video. As always, hopefully you... Oh. Let's just quickly end this with a little bit of a stall crashes into freaking silo. Perfect. I was wondering why my joystick was leaning. Then I checked the under it, and there it is, the cable's there. Under the joystick. Awesome. Right, but anyway, we reached 2000 feet, and then off with the time lapse. Reach and see you when I find a awesome thumbnail idea.
Bonus!
I think I found my little spot here. I'm gonna quickly take a little snippet. Alright, that's our snippet for the day. And let's continue. Runway is ahead of us. Perfect. Coming into land. I think this one's very long, so I can. Come on. May this be a good landing. Butter. So yeah, this is the second part of town. Follower special, we've made it. The time right now, the time is 20:29:46. Set that new time. 29:46, and yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this. Great morning, afternoon, evening. Like and subscribe. Follow my other socials. And I'll have to and just realized when I looked at my recording software, I don't have my YouTuber model, so that'll be a bit of a oopsie. So this time there's just not gonna be a water, or I'll just say that in the beginning of the video. So hope you enjoyed this, and well, see you on the next part of. Can I get this prop plane across Europe? Yeah. Bye.